So my name is Brandon, this is Ben, this is Helen, and our project is the origins of humans. So before we begin our project, I just want to give a little overview of how this came about. So our timeline is approximately 7.5 to 8 million years ago to our present. And what we're presenting on is, it focuses on the split between what we have as our modern nations, bonobos, to the hominid lineage that led up to what we are today, us Homo sapiens. Now this is the most widely accepted hypothesis of how we came about. What is still unknown though is our missing link that connects our two lineages together. And so that's what is still being deliberated between scientists currently. So we see development of various traits that we cover from our descendants, such as like the acquirance of bipedalism, which is walking on 2 feet rather than 4. We see larger set of teeth and jaws, a reduction in canines, which are like the sharper teeth in the front, larger brain size, development of full languages, onto the more development of the arts. So with that, all these developing traits, we see a large geographical shift. Most primarily we see, so we have our main first species that diverged, which was the Sahelanthropus species. And so that was generally found, the fossils from there were found in West Central Africa, so in the country of Chad. As we went on, like Orogennesis and the Ramidus, we see them moving more toward the Ethiopian and Kenyan area. Eventually, there was a migration from that area toward more toward Europe and the Middle East and on to Asia from then on. So what makes us humans are these, we have human anapomorphies. Anapomorphies are these certain traits that characterize us as humans and specific to our own character. That is like bipedalism, brain morphology, smaller canine teeth like I mentioned, S-shaped spine, and development of language. And that's what we're going to be talking more about. To go back a little bit on the geographical shift, there was a study conducted by Schultz and Maslin from the University of Manchester in the UK that say that early human evolution is characterized by pulse speciation and dispersal of events, not as continuous as you think it would be. It wasn't very linear, it was in bursts. And so what the study showed was that hominid evolution occurred it seemed to be associated with climate pulses and the disappearance of the deep African rift lakes. So these deep lakes, as they started to dry up, there were dry periods of time, the species tended to move away. This happened approximately 1.9 million years ago. So based off our timeline, we can see that that's towards more Homo erectus, one of our own descendants, or one of our own ancestors, excuse me. And so it showed that from then on, they led to a direct correlation that drying up, that lack of lakes and the dry period led to also a larger brain size that was consistent with that. And so the way we found, once we have our evidence, the way they found it was we found our fossils. And so we had to date them. There was the way we dated them were one of two ways scientists dated them. So our first way was molecular clock. So with the molecular clock, the way it was done was we have our calibration point. And this calibration point happened before the hominid and the apes. It was the point where the apes diverged from the great apes. And so we get that point based on the DNA sequences of these species. We're able to compare the rate that the nucleotides either mutate or are substituted, and that way we judge the variances between the species. Another way we date fossils is through radiometric dating. Now usually radiometric dating is done with igneous rocks. Igneous rocks are a result of volcanic molten lava. So the molten rocks harden, and what happens is radioactive atoms are trapped inside, and because they decay at a predictable rate, we're able to judge how long that rock has been around based on how much of the radioactive atom is left. The problem arises with fossils is that fossils, the best fossils we have are found in sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock is a result of a very gentle process, like lakes like lake rocks usually find around lakes because it's a very gentle flow of water, sediment collecting, and that sort of thing. So it's a very, very gentle process, and it is dated with using radioactive carbon. The radioactive carbon decays at a very quick rate. Around our research showed that around approximately 50,000 years or so, it is gone. And so when you have fossils that are over that amount of time, which is not that, in the grand scheme of things, this is very, very, very short amount of time. We have to look at other ways to date. So what scientists do, is they look at the igneous rock above and below the fossil, and based on the slow radioactive decaying elements such as uranium and potassium, they're able to know the youngest and the oldest rock that are there, therefore bracketing in what the fossil potentially could be in the time frame the fossil could potentially be. And so, that being said, I'm going to let Ben tell you a little more of the specifics of our species here.
So basically what we kind of started with the initial divergence between the chimp and bonobo clade and the hominin clade is Sahelanthropus tchadensis. He started to explain a little bit about it, but this is a really small, in terms of size, about the size of a modern day chimp. They're an arboreal species, and their brain size is about 350 cubic centimeters, and that's about the size of a modern day chimp's brain. So they had a lot of similarities to them, but a few key differences that started setting them apart is the start of development of bipedalism in terms of posture and also dentation. The canines, chimps have a much sharper, larger canine teeth and different molar pattern. So Sahelanthropus tchadensis started with reduced canine size. It is said they lived in modern day Chad in a very dense forest environment, which is why they were arboreal. They were herbivorous, and they lived about 7 to 6 billion years ago.
Okay, so as we said before, this is the earliest known human ancestor, and we found a skull in 2001 in Chad, West Africa, and that skull suggested more upright walking, the beginnings of becoming more vertical in bipedalism, as we were talking about before, because there's the hole in the skull, which is called the foramen magnum, and that's where the brain connects to the spinal cord, and that's what was showing more vertical walking. And there are similarities to the chimp where the sloped forehead found in the skulls, and that was more ape-like, and there were also more jaw pieces and teeth found in 2002 that showed more similarities to chimps, but also a little bit more development towards upward walking.
So moving on to the next species in the line is Aurantigensis. So while Sahelanthropus was over more in central western Africa, these other guys are more over in eastern Africa. Kenya, Ethiopia, Tanzania. So Aurantigensis had a lot of similarities to Sahelanthropus tchadensis in terms of relative size. It was only slightly larger than it. It had about, they were arboreal as well, except they were living in Kenya, but still in a forest environment. They were also herbivorous, but they had greater selection for bipedalism. There was more pronounced Cro-Magnon in the back of the skull, where, as you were saying, the spine connects, where you're going to have a more upright head on the body if it's more upright posture, walking on 2 feet. So these guys lived about 6.2 to 5.8 million years ago, and they also continued this trend of kind of reducing the size of the canine and the shape of the canine, and also the thickness of the molar. Humans have a much thicker enamel in their molar compared to the chimps. So these guys have a slowly developing thickening of the molars in the back and changing of the shape and formation of the dentation in the teeth.
Yeah, in 1974, paleontologists found a separate molar that showed that thicker enamel that was similar to modern humans now. And in 2004 in Kenya, there was limbs, jaws, and 2 mandibles found that showed the difference in the species, and that basically made it the species that it is that was different from apes. And there's also a larger femur in this species, which made it better for walking, but still able for it to be arboreal, like Ben was saying.
So up next we have Ardipithecus remidus, and this is one of the biggest changes from these very chimp-like in terms of size and characteristics. So Ardipithecus was quadrupedal in the trees, but bipedal on the ground. So it was using all four limbs in the trees for climbing, moving and about, but on the ground it was walking on 2 feet. So it was living in Ethiopia, also in a forest environment, from about 4.4 to 4.2 million years ago. So these guys have still a similar kind of brain. They've got 300 to 350 cubic centimeters, so about the same as the chimpanzees earlier. And it's only marginally bigger than Aurora gigantus in terms of body size. The biggest part that was a big change is Ardipithecus remidus has a rigid foot. Chimps have a very flexible foot, good for grasping, and because they use their feet a lot more in terms of climbing, moving around. But Ardipithecus has a rigid foot because that makes walking on 2 feet much easier. It's greater support for the entire body. But they still had an opposable toe. Opposable toes are a big part of primates. In terms, it's basically a thumb on the foot. So they still had a separate opposable toe, which they had control of, but the movement of more the rigid feet is kind of developing more bipedalistic traits, and also continuing more dentition patterns with thickening molars, changing the formation of the teeth in the mouth as well, and once again, the canines. There's also an increase in jaw size and teeth size overall, because as it's becoming a larger and larger species over time, the mouth and jaw grows with it and adjusts to that.
Yeah, in 2005 is when we started finding those rigid feet fossils that were showing us how the feet were walking more and less. It was a lot less climbing, and then but on the side of the foot was still that sticking out thumb that Ben was talking about. And this species had a smaller body that was similar to humans, but still more ape-like in its shape. And it was also, like you said, more in Ethiopian, more moving in towards that area, and those were found in the 90s. And they're mostly dental remains, but also finding those feet and hands really important for the findings are.
So Sahelanthropus gigantus, Aurora gigantus, and Ardipithecus remidus are all the earliest species in the hominid lineage. So these all share a lot of characteristics with the tree because it's a very early divergence from them. So when we come up on Australopithecus afarensis,
Which is what we have a model here on the screen for you of the skull fossil.
so this is one of like more intermediate place in between like the ape characteristics, the chimp characteristics, and human characteristics. So these guys were also in Eastern Africa, but had a relatively large distribution between like Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia. They lived 3.85 to 2.95 million years ago. A big characteristic change is there's a much greater increase in skull size. Their brain is now 500 cubic centimeters. So this is going to be another one of the continuing trends in terms of increasing skull and brain size, the tooth patterns, and bipedalistic features. Also, another major factor that Australopithecus afarensis exhibited was sexual dimorphism. Prior to them, there's very little difference between male and females. But here, males are about 4 foot 11 inches, 92 pounds, while females are only 3 foot 5 inches. So there's a big difference in terms of size and weight. So there's a lot of ape-like facial proportions, but more human-like molar pattern in terms of a Y5, meaning that there's 5 cusps on the molar, which are the bumps that, in terms of grinding, they're good for breaking down food well, and they're in a Y pattern, which is what humans have a similar type of pattern in modern.
And the most important fossil find in Afarensis is Lucy. You might have heard of it before, but Lucy was found in 1974, and it was a partial skeletal find, but it was a lot of bones that were found. And Lucy was important because it was just kind of like as Ben was saying, Lucy was obviously a female to the paleontologist, and you could see that sexual dimorphism. And then later on, they found something that they named Lucy's baby, and that was in 2000, and that was the earliest juvenile hominid found. And they found a knee, lower jaw, and a partial skeleton. So that was a lot of fossils that were found, and that gave us a lot of information there. And there was also Lucy's big brother that was also found, and showing us that sexual dimorphism again. And so that was a male fossils that they found. I guess not. Anyway, and they found ribs, shoulder blades, and pelvis and femurs. And so that was showing more how the males were larger and how they moved more in the, like Ben was saying, the intermediate stage between it becoming more like modern humans and also less ape-like.
And there was a study published by J. Michael Kaplan from the International Journal of Primatology that talked about sexual size dimorphism, that how it increased in the early Homo genus, which we'll be getting into, but it was consistent with the Australopithecus that said that as male size increased, female size increased as well. So that really made the implication that the female, there was a increase in sexual selection on the males, while females increased in size, it also implied that there was more resource availability for them as well.
Real quick on the screen, we were talking about the foramen magnum, the hole where the spinal cord attaches to the brain. That's this hole right here. And in a lot of the earlier species, it's much more back at the base of the skull, and there's a slow movement as it becomes more and more at the base of like the neck, because it's an upright view. And it's rather than looking forward, it's more looking straight on. So Australopithecus, also just a warning, these are mostly the key species. There's a large number of other minor species and small changes going on. So these are really kind of groups, like Ardipithecus group has a number of others, Australopithecus group has a number of others as well, but these are the main groups. So Australopithecus, one thing was some of the males had what's called a sagittal crest, which is a kind of a bone rise on top of the skull. So what's going on here is the first major divergence into the two groups. Here we have the Homo group and the Paranthropus group. So Paranthropus is characterized by enormous jaws, bigger teeth, and bigger skull. And they have much larger sagittal crest. And the sagittal crest is used to attach powerful chewing muscles and give it more power in terms of chewing in the mouth, being able to eat more coarse, difficult food like seeds and nuts. So Paranthropus robustus was in South Africa. There's other Paranthropus species that were also found in Eastern Africa with some of these others. And you can find, this is Paranthropus' skull here. It's got a much larger entire face, flatter than these earlier skulls.
And on the screen, you see a little side view of it as well, how it does have a flatter face, and how the cranium is just a larger structure.
So these guys were living on dry and open savannas, so they didn't have a lot of soft foods available. It was a lot of nuts, fibrous tubers, and seeds, things that are very hard to chew. So that's the reason behind this development of enormous jaw and chewing muscles. They also lived in social groups, kind of like gorillas, with a single dominant male and then a number of females in the group. These guys had a brain size of 530 cubic centimeters, so it's kind of a continuing trend of increasing brain size. They lived from 1.8 to 1.2 meters.
So the real big thing with robustus is, like Ben was saying, the wider face or the flatness of the face, and then the larger cheekbones, and that was giving room for larger chewing muscles, and that was changing what they were eating in the area. And so that was found in 1950 in South Africa. and they also found molar teeth with that, and so that was also changing the foods that they were eating.
So that's the Paranthropus group. Now we have the Homo group. So the first main person is going to be Homo erectus, and this is probably the most well-known of the early humans. These were extremely widely distributed, like all over Africa. They started in Eastern Africa and then spread out all over the continent and then out into Asia. And there's some controversy over Homo erectus versus Homo ergaster, but most scientists still choose to view the two as one and the same as Homo erectus, and only those who migrated out into Asia. So these were very social and communal species who were known to take care of their weak and elderly, showing more of like a communal bonding than how it wasn't seen prior. This is one with first real human proportions. They were very efficient at walking and running, so at this point bipedalism has been more fully selected for, and so they're able to move faster, more quickly, more efficiently. They had control of fire for the first time, and some relatively sophisticated stone tools. So another important part was a barrel chest versus a cone-like chest. Apes have more of a cone-like with wide ribs at the bottom, more tapering up to closer peak at the top. This is more of a rounder barrel chest as seen in modern humans. They had a very meat-centered diet because with all this movement and running and the increasing brain size, you're going to use up a lot more energy. And so meat was able to be digested more quickly through the short digestive system. These guys also had a range from 750 to 1250 cubic centimeters of brain size. It's a wide range because they were around from 1.89 million to 143,000 years. So it's a huge span of time that they were around. So over that time, brain size increased dramatically, which is why there's such a wide range of them.
The actual earliest Homo erectus that was found was in 1891, and that was found in Indonesia. And one thing that was very different about Homo erectus was there were no limbs found that were able to do a lot of tree climbing, and that was a lot of different from the earlier species. And one thing that we saw in the changes in the dental records was they were eating a lot more protein and more meat because they had they were growing larger brains, as Ben was saying, since they were there for so long. They were growing larger brains, and brain function was increasing, and so they needed a lot more protein for that energy.
So up next is Homo heidelbergensis. This was a species that developed out of Homo erectus. So they first developed in kind of Eastern Africa too. They had pretty clear sexual dimorphism, males being about 5'9", females 5'2", and about 40 pounds of difference between their weights. They had a brain size of 1,200 cubic centimeters, which is much larger compared to a lot of these previous ones. So with that, they had Mode 2 technology, which is chipped stone that they've been shaping it and purposefully manipulating it to get a more advanced, sophisticated tool. So they had other things like wooden spears and hammers and clubs and knives, and a lot of hunting and butchery tools, which was a major change in development and sophistication of these early humans. They were around Europe and a lot of East and South Africa. So the European heidelbergensis were shorter, more stout, so that gave them more heat conservation and allowed them to survive in a cold environment for the first time for early humans. Their diet also centered around meat. They also lived in cooperative groups, and they had much flatter face, but they still had an ape-like characteristic of a very sloped forehead. That's something that is carried on and selected for in the future.
So these fossil records were actually found more in Germany, and they were found as smaller and much more like modern humans. They had smaller teeth, smaller build, and like Ben was saying, they were shorter and more stout. And there were differences in jaws, and that's what really makes them different from the previous ones, were the jaw differences, and that one was really found. And they were also had rigid skulls and flatter faces. So that was what was bringing them closer to modern humans.
So here's our final divergence. From Heidelbergensis, we get both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens modern humans. The distinction between it is Homo neanderthalensis developed from Heidelbergensis, who were found in Europe. So the Homo neanderthalensis were also found around Europe, and they eventually migrated out more towards Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East. So these guys were more adapted for the cold environment of Europe, as kind of opposite of like the more tropical and hot natured Africa. So the Neanderthals had huge noses for a lot of air intake. They were really stout and very strong, very muscular, but they were very short and stout too for like Heidelbergensis for conservation of heat. There's a few like minor anatomical differences between Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals, such as like minor differences in the pubic bone and the shoulder blades, but overall they were relatively similar. And there was some interaction between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals and ability to interbreed. So they did have a lot of close ability to interact like that and interbreed, but there's still a few small differences that kind of set them apart.
The main differences are really in skull shape. That's what they were finding in. The first skull was found in 1829, actually, of the Neanderthals, and then they were later recognized, finding the differences between the Homo sapiens, which are us now, and the Neanderthals in the skull differences in the skull shapes, and that basically just goes back to brain function.
One key thing about Neanderthals too was that these were the first ones that were developing clothes. They were sewing. They also buried their dead for the first time. This was something that never had happened before in any of the Homo, or the humans, excuse me. So they had clothing, which was a first for them. They also had symbolic and ornamental objects, like little things that also cave paintings and art for the first time. So there's a lot more like social and mental capacity being expressed here.
It's important to note that the Neanderthals and the Homo sapiens were coexisting. They were not independent of each other. They were existing in different places at the same time.
So Homo sapiens actually developed from Heidelbergensis, found in Africa. So Homo sapiens developed more in Eastern Africa, and these are the modern humans. And there's several stages of Homo sapien, from very early archaic Homo sapien to late early period Homo sapien to late period Homo sapien to modern day humans. And so these guys first really kind of showed up about 300,000 years ago, and they're existing today to the present. They're us. So we have about a 1,300 cubic centimeter brain size, and early humans, early Homo sapiens, actually had a 1,500 cubic centimeter brain size. But over time and over adaptation and evolution, it became slightly smaller, more compact, with a very round cranium. Homo sapiens were the first to develop agriculture and domestication for the first time. That's about 11,000 years ago. Prior to that, they were hunter-gatherers, but they still had a lot more sophisticated technology because they had a lot more intellectual ability, bigger brain size. They outlasted the Neanderthals, they outlasted Homo erectus, Heidelbergensis. So they have a lot of firsts. Language, the most advanced tools, Mode 5, Mode 6, using like bone and antler and other materials to make their tools rather than just chipping stones. They developed agriculture that led to major societies, and basically set up for the world as is today. And that's
Well, on the back, what we did, we put a few more pieces of evidence so you can actually visually see how things change. So, quadripedalism versus bipedalism. The monkeys, or the earlier species of in the hominin line, how they were, and the monkeys, they were more arched over, using all fours. Sometimes, as it progressed toward bipedalism, like as we were sitting on 2 feet, it was more of like, earlier on, it was more of occasional. So they would be up and bipedally active, but normally they would be walking on all fours. And so you can also see, like with other parts of evidence, fossils, we have a lot of fossils, but we also have evidence of their tools. Rocks were getting from duller, they were getting sharper. So they're more effective in terms of how they were able to sharpen tools and that sort of thing. And so also going back a little bit to the migration, as you can see from this map we have, while they originated in East Central Africa, there was a lot toward the West Central Africa. They were a lot toward the eastern area, like you said earlier, Kenya, Ethiopia, and they did migrate all through Asia and up and through Europe.
So these little charts also help you kind of visualize the changes that have been happening over this whole lineage, in terms of rounding of the skull and cranium, reduction of the canines. These are representing kind of general teeth. So you can see this is a chimpanzee, much sharper canine, much smaller square molars. Over time, Ardipithecus and Australopithecus, those are some of the early ones, the first Homo. There's a clear reduction in the size and the shape of the canine, and also a more uniform shaping of the molars. What isn't being represented here is the thickness of the molar, and what they're chewing more with meat and being able to handle their diets differently.
Okay, you've gone a half an hour, so one more minute. Wrap it up.
Cool. That shows the teeth, how that's the last common ancestor that they know of. These are early hominins. You can see how they kind of change from these ape shape to more uniform human shape. So,
With that, do you have any other questions?
Actually, I do have one question. You said they started in Africa. How did Native Americans get here?
So back then, there was a number of climate changes. There was some early Ice Age stuff. So what the Ice Age did was it formed a land bridge because it took up a lot of the water and lowered ocean levels, or sea levels, just enough that a land bridge was able to form between would be Russia and Antarctica now. And it took a while, but that's how Native Americans got over there. They're Homo sapiens still, but they just made it over through the land bridge theory. And there's also some theory that there is habitation about the Polynesian islands, and they were well known for traveling island to island on their boats and really exploring more than a lot of other early humans were.
Let me ask one. Why did they move out of the trees? So what was the driving force? So what would be the advantage of walking and not just staying in the trees?
Well, one of the advantages of bipedalism is a lot more ability to move more quickly over long distances, because if you're arboreal, you're kind of limited to the forest in your immediate area. Being on the ground and being able to have access to a lot more different food sources would be extremely beneficial, especially if there's any sort of environmental changes going on. Like we said, there's a lot of changes in terms of like hot and cold, so that's kind of playing with the plant life and the forest life, and it's kind of making it very different. There's not a lot of like continuity and relative like peace. There's a lot of like changes going on, and And so they're having to adapt and be able to get to other food sources. And then,
So by diversifying your food source, you're also getting those nutrients you normally would not be getting. So that just overall increases your survival ability as a species.
And like I said before, like the need for protein and that making tools, and then like Ben was saying, like bipedally walking, you see them making faster, and then they needed tools to do some game hunting for getting the protein for energy, which would be better than, nuts and roots.
you saw with how the farther you went up in the Homo lineage, these larger, more bipedally capable species, the more they traveled. And with the last Homo sapiens being the most adept at migrating because they're mastered the bipedal movements and adaptations for survival in this environment best and able to travel all over the world and explore and happen.
Thank you.